because of timing issues and other things, this is the best time we could do that. Anyway, after last weekend's sermon, hopefully that would have given you a bit of a taste for what to come today. So this morning we are very glad and privileged to have with us Dr. Philip Satterthwaite. He is an Old Testament scholar and also presently the principal of the Biblical Graduate School of Theology. So in many ways, he'll be much better placed to share with you about how do we read this very interesting, very important section of Scripture, Genesis 1 to 11, the primeval history, much more than certainly the speaker last weekend, whoever that may have been. So yeah, I'm not going to delay this any longer. Allow me to just commit this session to the Lord, and I'm going to invite Dr. Satterthwaite up. Okay, let's pray. Father, we thank you for the privilege that we have of studying your word, the word that has come from you. And especially today as we consider this foundational section of your word, Genesis 1 to 11, we do ask that you will be with us and illumine our minds to understand how to better read this very foundational, very important section of Scripture. We pray that you will bless Dr. Satterthwaite, that as he speaks to us, allow him to be able to present his material clearly, and that we might be able to understand after these few hours how to approach this section of Scripture. So be with us and allow us to learn the things that you want us to learn this morning. Thank you, Lord. In Jesus' name we pray.
Amen.
So can we put our hands together to welcome Dr. Satterthwaite?
Thank you very much for the welcome. Thank you for inviting me to speak to you this morning, and thank you all for coming to this seminar. I've given today's seminar the title Genesis 1 to 11, Then and Now. I want us to consider three topics relating to Genesis 1 to 11. First, I want us to consider Genesis 1 to 11 in its ancient Near Eastern context, comparing Genesis 1 to 11 with other texts from the ancient Near East. I believe gives us some insight into how Israelite readers might have read Genesis 1 to 11. And this is important for how we read the text. Second, I want us to... Sorry, is there a problem?
Yeah, you're not coming through.
Oh. So,
if you leave that one in.
Okay.
So I've just muted this for now. I'll go and unmute it.
Okay. So perhaps give me a thumbs up when you're... I've become the bionic man. All right. So first topic, Genesis 1 to 11 in its ancient Near Eastern context. Second, I want us to consider Genesis 1 to 11 as a foundation for the rest of the Bible. Everything in the Bible begins with Genesis 1 to 11. It's the start of what I call the biblical storyline. It also provides a foundation for Christian ethics, and when it comes to forming a Christian worldview, Genesis 1 to 11 is also a key text. And third, I want us to consider the question of literal versus non-literal readings of Genesis 1 to 11. How are we to understand the account of the world and of human origins given to us in Genesis 1 to 11? What kind of an account are these chapters? And this also brings in modern views of cosmic and human origins. I've deliberately placed the issue of literal versus non-literal readings of Genesis 1 to 11 in third position in the order of presentation this morning. In my view, this is not the most important question to ask about these chapters, but it has been asked, and I dare say you're curious as to what I think, so I will say something about this. I should say that by training, I am not well qualified to handle the scientific issues which have been discussed in connection with Genesis 1 to 11. I stopped studying physics and chemistry at school when I was 15. That is now 45 years ago. I never really studied biology at school at all. Now, in the years since then, I have done some reading in the general field of science and religion. About 30 years ago, I read Colin Russell's helpful survey, Cross Currents. I've also read some of Alistair McGrath's writings. Most recently, I've been reading Desmond Alexander's Creation or Evolution, Do We Have to Choose? I must admit, however, that I don't fully understand all the science that these writers refer to. arguments relating to the age of the universe, arguments relating to geology and the decay of radioisotopes, arguments relating to genes and DNA. If you ask me to explain any of these topics, I'm pretty sure I'd do a bad job. So if you want to ask me questions on these things, you may be coming to the wrong person. I'll try to give the best answer I can, or maybe invite some of you who may well understand these things better than me to answer instead of me. In order that you may know what kind of presentation you'll be hearing this morning, I would like to say up front that I do not believe that we should read Genesis 1 to 11 as a fully literal account of the origins of the universe, or of the natural world, or of human beings. Obviously, part of the question here depends on how we define the terms literal and non-literal, and I will address this issue at the appropriate point. So much by way of introduction. Now the first major section. Genesis 1 to 11 in its ancient Near Eastern context. In the past 150 or so years, tens of thousands of texts have been unearthed in the lands of the ancient Near East. That's to say, in Mesopotamia, Syria, Turkey, Palestine, and Egypt. We're talking here of clay tablets, stone inscriptions, and when you come to the very dry climate of Egypt, even papyrus texts, which have survived for thousands of years. Tens of thousands of texts have been discovered and thought about over the last 150 years, after a long, long period, thousands of years, when they weren't known about. But in the last 150 years, tens of thousands of these texts have become available to us. Naturally, not all of these texts are of equal importance, but these texts have come to feature significantly in Old Testament studies. Why this focus on ancient Near Eastern texts when studying the Old Testament? Well, among other reasons, because Israel itself was part of the ancient Near East. Hence, studying these texts gives us some understanding of what we may call the thought world of ancient Israel. One recent study or survey of these ancient Near Eastern texts by John Walton has the title Ancient Near Eastern Thought and the Old Testament. And the subtitle of this book is Introducing the Conceptual World of the Hebrew Bible. In other words, studying ancient Near Eastern texts gives us an idea of the sense of the ideas which were current in the ancient Near East at particular periods. These texts tell us what people in the ancient Near East thought about the gods, creation, war, famine, family relations, and a host of other things. Studying Old Testament texts against the background of other ancient Near Eastern texts helps us to see what the Old Testament texts have in common with these other texts, and also what is distinctive about the Old Testament texts. And this in turn gives us a sense of how particular Old Testament texts would have been understood by an Israelite audience. Now that is a key question in biblical interpretation. How would the people for whom this biblical text was written have understood it? What would the biblical text have meant for its first hearers or its first readers? I believe that must always be our starting point in interpreting and flood accounts, and there are both among the texts which have come down to us from the ancient Near East. Excuse me. One of the most interesting ancient Near Eastern creation accounts, I'm sorry, we should move on a slide. One of the most interesting ancient Near Eastern accounts is the Babylonian text named after its first two words, Enuma Elish, which means in Akkadian, when on high, and it's just the first two words of the text. If you're interested in reading this text itself, I've given some references in the book list at the back of the handout. A translation of this can be found in the first volume of the collection entitled The Context of Scripture, Volume 1. And if you're really interested in following this up, I can tell you how to access this text. Now, it is thought that this text, Enuma Elish, was written around about 1100 BC because of the prominent role in it of the Babylonian god Marduk. The worship of Marduk was particularly promoted in Babylon around 1100 BC, around this period. And this text, celebrating Marduk as creator and ruler of the world, seems to have been produced as part of a tendency to magnify Marduk, if you can put it that way. So I want to take you through this text, summarizing portions, reading other sections. And I hope that as I read the sections, you'll notice certain features which remind you, certain things in the text which remind you of parts of particularly Genesis 1. So the text begins with two deities named Apsu and Tiamat, water deities representing fresh water and salt water respectively. These two deities procreate and give birth to a number of other deities, and that's what we read about at the beginning of the text. Now, as I read this text, there'll be quite a number of unfamiliar names, because this is a polytheistic text, and there are many names of gods. So bits of it may be a little hard to understand. Try not to stumble over the details, but to grasp the broad outline. So we begin. This is from the beginning of the text. When on high, no name was given to heaven, nor below was the netherworld called by name, primeval Apsu was their progenitor, and matrix Tiamat was she who bore them all. They were mingling their waters together. No canebrake was intertwined, nor thicket matted close. When no gods at all had been brought forth, none called by names, no destinies ordained, then were the gods formed within these two. Lachmu and Lachamu were brought forth, were called by name. When they had waxed great, had grown up tall, Anshar and Kishar were formed, greater than they. They grew lengthy of days, added years to years, and their firstborn was like his forebears. Anshu made Anu his offspring, his equal. Then Anu begot his own image, Nudimud. Nudimud was he who dominated his forebears. Profound in wisdom, acute of sense, he was massively strong, much mightier than his grandfather Anshar. No rival had he among the gods his brethren. The divine brethren banded together, confusing Tiamat as they moved about in the air, roiling the vitals of Tiamat, by their uproar distressing the interior of the divine abode. So the gods are starting to multiply, and this is giving the goddess Tiamat, as it were, internal problems. It's as though it's giving her a bad stomachache, all these other gods moving about and making a commotion somehow inside her or disturbing her. So, as the text goes on, tensions and conflicts multiply among the gods until Tiamat raises up a great army of deities and other creatures to wage war against the other gods. So we're moving on to a description of cosmic conflict between the gods in this polytheistic text. And I read you a short section. It's quite a long text, so I'm giving you a very abbreviated version. So Tiamat forms her army. Tiamat assembled her creatures, drew up for battle against the gods her brood. Thereafter Tiamat, more than Apsu, was become an evildoer. She informed Ea, kind of chief among the other gods, that she was ready for battle. When Ea heard this, he was struck dumb with horror and sat stock still. After he had thought and his distress had calmed, he made straight his way to Anshar, his grandfather. He came in before his grandfather, Anshar. All that Tiamat plotted, he recounted to him. My father, Tiamat, our mother, has grown angry with us. She has convened an assembly, furious with rage. All the gods rallied round her. Even those you created are going over to her side. They are massing around her, ready at Tiamat's side. And the text continues for a while. And at this point, Marduk steps forward and says, don't worry, I'll sort it out. I will do battle against Tiamat and her hordes. Are we doing all right for... That's it, yes, we're still on this one. Good. Marduk came forward, the sage of the gods, your son. He has resolved to go against Tiamat. When he spoke, he said to me, if indeed I am to champion you, subdue Tiamat and save your lives, Convene the assembly, nominate me for the supreme destiny. In the assembly place of the gods, take your places, all of you in joyful mood. When I speak, let me ordain destinies instead of you. Let nothing that I shall bring about be altered, nor what I say be revoked or changed. Hurry to me, straightway ordain him your destinies, let him go and confront your powerful enemy. So Marduk says, okay, I'll solve the problem for you, but in return, you've got to make me chief god. From now on, I'm going to be the one who has a final say in things. Marduk goes into battle, and battle duly takes place against Tiamat. And I think it's perhaps here that you'll notice particularly one or two echoes of Genesis 1 to 11. Somewhat distant echoes, but perhaps you'll catch them. So Marduk and Tiamat draw near to battle. Tiamat, and this is quite a long quotation, but let me just go on. Tiamat shrieked loud in a passion. Her frame shook all over, down to the ground. He, Marduk, was reciting the incantation, casting his spell, while the gods of battle were whetting their blades. Tiamat and Marduk, sage of the gods, drew close for battle. They locked in single combat, joining for the fray. The Lord spread out his net, encircled her. The ill wind he had held behind him, he released in her face. Tiamat opened her mouth to swallow. He thrust in the ill wind so that she could not close her lips. The raging winds bloated her belly. Her insides were stopped up. She gaped her mouth wide. He shot off the arrow. It broke open her belly. It cut to her innards. It pierced the heart. He subdued her and snuffed out her life. He flung down her carcass. He took his stand upon it. After the vanguard had slain Tiamat, he scattered her forces. He dispersed her host. As for the gods, her allies, who had come to her aid, they trembled, terrified. They ran in all directions. They tried to make a way out to save their lives. There was no escaping the grasp that held them. He drew them in and smashed their weapons. They were cast in the net and sat in a heap. They were heaped up in the corners, full of woe. They were bearing his punishment, to prison confined. As for the 11 creatures, the ones adorned with glories, and the demonic horde, which all went at a side, he put on lead ropes, he bound their arms, he trampled them under, together with their belligerents. As for Kingu, who was trying to be great among them, he captured him and reckoned him among the doomed. He took away from him the tablet of destinies that he had no right to. He sealed it with a seal and affixed it to his chest. Having captured his enemies and triumphed, having shown the mighty foe subservient, having fully achieved Anshar's victory over his enemies, valiant Marduk, having attained what Nudimmud desired, he made firm his hold over the captured gods. Then he turned back to Tiamat, whom he had captured. The Lord trampled upon the frame of Tiamat. With his merciless mace, he crushed her skull. He cut open the arteries of her blood. He let the north wind bear it away as glad tidings. When his fathers saw, they rejoiced and were glad. They brought him gifts and presents. He calmed down. Then the Lord was inspecting her carcass, that he might divide the monstrous lump and fashion artful things. He split her in two, like a fish for drying. Half of her he set up and made as a cover, heaven. He stretched out the hide and assigned watchmen and ordered them not to let her waters escape. He crossed heaven and inspected its firmament. He made a counterpart to Apsu, the dwelling of Nudimmud. The Lord measured the construction of Apsu. He founded the great sanctuary, the likeness of Eshara. In the great sanctuary, in Eshara, which he built, and in heaven, he made Enlil. Ea and Anu dwell in their holy places. So he's defeated Tiamat, killed her, starts to do things with her body. He's captured all her hordes, kind of the generals and all the troops. All the army is now captive or killed. And Marduk is in control, and he now sets about the work of creation. In fact, he's already started it with that making of the firmament out of part of Tiamat's body. And he goes on with the act of creation. So the picture is that the creator deity first of all defeats rival deities and then starts to create. And that's the Babylonian conception of creation. So we read, he made the positions for the great gods. He established in constellation the stars, their likenesses. He marked the year, described its boundaries. He set up 12 months of 3 stars each. After he had patterned the days of the year, he fixed the position of Neberu, that's the Milky Way, to mark the stars' relationships, lest any make an error or go astray. He established the positions of Enlil and Ea in relation to it. He opened up gates on both sides of her ribs, Tiamat's ribs. He made strong bolts to left and right. In her liver he established the zenith. He made the moon appear, entrusted to him the night. He assigned to him the crown jewel of nighttime to mark the day of the month. Every month without ceasing, he exalted him with a crown. At the beginning of the month, waxing over land, you shine with horns to mark 6 days. At the 7th day, the discus half. At the 15th day, you shall be in opposition at the midpoint of each month, when the sun faces you from the horizon of heaven. Wane at the same place and form in reverse. At the day of disappearance, approach the sun's course. On the 30th day, you shall be in conjunction with the sun for a second time. So we're getting quite a lot of Babylonian astronomy here, and the different phases of the moon are being described. All right. So Marduk has created the world, and the account at a later point turns to the creation of humanity. When Marduk heard the speech of the gods, he was resolving to make artful things. He would tell his idea to Ea. What he thought of in his heart, he proposes. I shall compact blood. I shall cause bones to be. I shall make man a human being. I shall make stand a human being. Let man be its name. I shall create humankind. They shall bear the gods' burdens, that those may rest. So man is made to work for the gods. Quite an important point, and one that's reflected in other ancient Near Eastern texts. How does Marduk set about making man? Well, we read on. I shall artfully double the ways of the gods. Let them be honoured as one, but divided in twain. So now he's saying, I'm going to make man male and female. How's it going to happen? Let one of the gods be given to me. Let him be destroyed so that people can be fashioned. Let the great gods convene in assembly. Let the guilty one be given up that they may abide. Marduk convened the great gods in assembly. He said, in effect, who was it who made war against me? Who's the guilty party? Who's the guilty god? And the gods all answered at him, it was Kingu who made war. He's the guilty one. So they imposed punishment on him and shed his blood. From his blood he made mankind. He imposed the burden of the gods and exempted the gods. After Ea the wise had made mankind, they imposed the burden of the gods on them. That deed is beyond comprehension. By the artifices of Marduk did Nudimud create. Now, this is quite a long and somewhat repetitive narrative, and I've given you relatively short excerpts from it. And the presence of all these divine names in the text also does not make it easy to follow. But we see, I think, some points of similarity with the creation accounts in Genesis 1 and 2. Enuma Elish mentions waters, the deities Apsu and Tiamat, at the beginning of the account. We can compare the reference to waters at the beginning of Genesis 1. In Enuma Elish, Marduk divides Tiamat's corpse into two and uses part of the corpse, her hide, to make a cover which separates the upper and the lower waters. We can compare the dome or the firmament described in Genesis 1. Marduk proposes making humans who will be both male and female. Let them be honoured as one, but divided in twain. We can compare God's proposal to make humanity at Genesis 1:26. Let us make humankind in our image. So points of similarity, but there are also important points of difference. The most obvious difference is that whereas Enuma Elish is a polytheistic text in which many deities feature, Genesis 1 is monotheistic. This can be seen in many ways. Like Genesis 1, Enuma Elish mentions waters as present at the beginning of the creation. But these waters in Enuma Elish are seen as deities, the deities Apsu and Tiamat. But the waters at the beginning of Genesis 1 are simply an inert mass, a body of water. They're not in any sense divine. In the same way, there is no need for God in Genesis 1 to defeat any rival deity, to fight any other god before setting about the work of creation, for there are no other gods or goddesses around to be defeated. Genesis 1, by comparison with a text like Enuma Elish, stands out as a strongly monotheistic text, telling us that there is one creator God. The polytheistic worldview of Enuma Elish affects the way in which the act of creation is understood. Creation in this text in this text either takes place by a process analogous to human procreation, as when Apsu and Tiamat mingle their waters at the beginning of the account, or a deity is killed and then its body is used as raw material for creating something else. So Tiamat's hide becomes the cover of the heavens. Humankind is formed from the blood of the rebellious god Kingu. But in Genesis 1, the different stages of creation unfold in a different way. There's no creation, there's no chopping up of bits of other gods to form parts of the created order. God simply speaks, and something happens. Something comes into being, or something happens to what has been created already. So separations are made. That's how creation takes place in Genesis 1, by the powerful word of God. It's a very significant point, actually. In biblical thought, the created order is made by God, all of it, but no part of it is divine. And therefore, no part of it should be worshipped. In Genesis 1, there's a clear divide between creator and creation. In a text like Enuma Elish, that divide is rather blurred, and basically bits of the divine find their way into what is created. Okay, that's Enuma Elish. I don't have time to take you through a lot of other ancient Near Eastern texts, and having heard snippets of one of them, you may be quite grateful for that fact. But I should say that similar sorts of things could be said about creation accounts from other parts of the ancient Near East, for instance, from Egypt. But now I want to turn to some other Old Testament texts. In Genesis 1, there are no rival deities. There are no sea monsters which the Creator God has to defeat before the work of creation. But there are Old Testament texts in which we seem to find echoes of such things. And one of these texts is found in Psalm 74. I won't bother describing the context of the psalm. If you want to, you can read the psalm later and see how these verses fit into the context. But I want to read you a section in which the psalmist is describing God's work as creator. And essentially, the train of thought here is, look, God, you made the world. Why is it so difficult to intervene and save your people? So at this point, he says something about God as creator. Psalm 74, verse 12. Yet God my King is from of old, working salvation in the earth. You divided the sea by your might. You broke the heads of the dragons in the waters. You crushed the heads of Leviathan. You gave him as food for the creatures of the wilderness. You cut up openings for springs and torrents. You dried up ever-flowing streams. Yours is the day, yours also the night. You established the luminaries and the sun. You have fixed the bounds of the earth. You made summer and water. So this is clearly a text which speaks about God as creator. Note those references to day and night and to stars and sun and moon at the end of the text. But what are these references to the dragons? You broke the heads of the dragons in the waters and crushing the heads of leviathans. What are these references doing in the text? Just to remind you, we don't read of any of these things in Genesis 1. Equally interesting is a similar text found in Isaiah 51, verses 9 to 11. This is when God's people in exile in Babylon call out to God to deliver them. And we read, Isaiah 51, verse 9, Awake, awake, put on strength, O arm of the Lord. Awake as in days of old, the generations long ago. Was it not you who cut Rahab in pieces, who pierced the dragon? Was it not you who dried up the sea, the waters of the great deep, who made the depths of the sea a way for the redeemed to cross over? So the ransomed of the Lord shall return and come to Zion with singing. Everlasting joy shall be upon their heads. They shall obtain gladness, and sorrow and sighing shall flee away. The last verse will be familiar to it. You've probably sung choruses reminding you of that. I wonder if you sung choruses about God chopping up Rahab and the dragon, the verses immediately preceding. You've got the same language of killing sea monsters, cutting Rahab in pieces, piercing the dragon. But here it's used, interestingly, not in relation to God's act of creation, but in relation to the Exodus. God made the depths of the sea a way for the redeemed to cross over. So the language here is used of God's power as it was displayed at the time of the Exodus, drying up the waters of the Reed Sea. And of course, that's the point in Isaiah 40-50, that another Exodus is going to take place, an Exodus from Babylon back to the land. So it's very appropriate that the text should speak of the Exodus at this point. Well, what do we make of these references to Rahab, Leviathan, and sea dragons in the Old Testament text? Did the Israelites believe in these entities? Did they believe in a primordial battle in which God fought against these monsters? Did they believe indeed that God fought against monsters like these at the time of the Exodus? And of course, there's no reference to Rahab and the dragons in Exodus either. Surely not, I would say. So what is happening in these two texts? What we see in these texts is what I term polemical reappropriation, or to put the point more simply, you make a point against me, but I take your point, give it a different spin, and turn it round and throw it back at you. The peoples of the ancient Near East conveyed the power of deities like Marduk, Baal, and other creator gods by picturing them as defeating sea deities and sea monsters. And the Israelites sometimes responded to this by taking the imagery of piercing Rahab and chopping dragons to pieces and using that imagery to suggest the power of the Lord, the God of Israel. In effect, the Israelites were telling the surrounding nations, and perhaps also reminding themselves, no, our God is the one who did all that stuff. There is only one God who created the world, and that is the God we worship. All that language which you use to refer to your creator gods about chopping up dragons, you ought to be thinking of in relation to our God, because our God is the sole creator. Polemical reappropriation, taking an idea from the surrounding culture and giving it a distinctive twist in order to convey a particular message to the surrounding culture. Bearing all this in mind, what is happening in Genesis 1? What happened there? I speak of Genesis 1, strictly speaking, I mean Genesis 1:1 to 2 verse 4, the 7-day account. Well, let me just read the opening verses of this account, just so that you can get a sense, just so that we can remind ourselves of the style, the very powerful and impressive style of the opening verses of Genesis. I'll read verses 1 to 18. In the beginning, when God created the heavens and the earth was a formless void, and darkness covered the face of the deep, while a wind from God swept over the face of the waters. Then God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And God saw that the light was good, and God separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening, and there was morning, the first day. And God said, "Let there be a dome in the midst of the waters, and let it separate waters from the waters." So God made the dome and separated the waters that were under the dome from the waters that were above the dome. And it was so. God called the dome sky, and there was evening, and there was morning, the second day. And God said, "Let the waters under the sky be gathered together into one place, and let the dry land appear." And it was so. God called the dry land earth, and the waters that were gathered together he called seas. And God saw that it was good. Then God said, "Let the earth put forth vegetation, plants yielding seed, and fruit trees of every kind on earth that bear fruit with a seed in it." And it was so. The earth brought forth vegetation, plants yielding seed of every kind, and trees of every kind, bearing fruit with a seed in it. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening, and there was morning, the third day. And God said, "Let there be lights in the dome of the sky to separate the day from the night, and let them be for signs and for seasons and for days and years, and let them be lights in the dome of the sky to give light upon the earth." And it was so. God made the two great lights, the greater light to rule the day, and the lesser light to rule the night, and the stars. God set them in the dome of the sky to give light upon the earth, to rule over the day and over the night, and to separate the light from the darkness. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening and there was morning, the fourth day. Now, what do you notice about this account? How would you describe the style of this account? What particular points stand out in this account? I note the following features. It's an account of creation which stresses God's power, God's absolute power. God speaks and things come into being, or things are separated. It's a very orderly account. It suggests a God in control of things. It's a very clearly structured account. You've got the balance of days 1 and 3 and days 4 and 6 in this account. In day 1, light and dark is separated. In day 4, sun, moon and stars, which will mark light and darkness created. In day 2, water and sky are created, or separated. In day 5, the sea creatures and the winged creatures are created. On day 3, the dry land emerges and plants are created. On day 6, land animals and humanity is created. There's a balance between days 1 to 3 and 4 to 6, suggesting a God in control, a God of order, a God who creates according to plan. It's a monotheistic account. We've made this point already. There are no other gods in Genesis 1, no rival deities to be defeated. As part of that, the sun and the moon and the stars are simply lights in the dome of the sky, as they're described when they're created on day 4. Now, this is significant because in some ancient Near Eastern religions, the sun and the moon and the stars were considered as deities or considered as influencing people's fates. And astrology was very big in the Mesopotamian nations. Will you note how the sun and the moon in verse 16 and following are referred to as the greater light and the lesser light? Now, Hebrew does have words for sun and moon, which it uses at other parts in the Old Testament, but these two words, Shemesh and Yareach, sound rather similar to the names by which other ancient Near Eastern nations worship the sun and the moon as deities. So I think deliberately these names, which might be reminiscent, which might conjure up to an Israelite hearer the name of a god, are excluded, and it's just the lesser light and the greater light, as though we were talking about two light bulbs of different sizes. Again, any sense that there's another god here is excluded from the text. This is an account which builds up to the creation of the first man and the first woman, who are made in the image of God. Then God said, "Let us make humankind in our image according to our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the air and over all the wild animals of the earth and over every creeping thing that creeps upon the earth." So God created humankind in his image. In the image of God he created them. Male and female he created them. God blessed them, and God said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it and have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the air and over every living thing that moves upon earth." God said, "See, I have given you every plant yielding seed that is upon the face of all the earth, and every tree with seed in its fruit. You shall have them for food. And to every beast of the earth, and to every bird of the air, and to everything that creeps upon the earth, everything that has the breath of life, I have given every green plant for food." So this is the kind of high point of the account. Only here does God declare his intentions before he sets about creating the first man and the first woman. And the man and the woman are encouraged to multiply. God wants there to be many men and women. And the significance of this will emerge soon. And the man and the woman and their descendants are giving a special calling. They are to exercise God's rule of the created order. Finally, the seventh day is a day of rest, perhaps by implication a time for God to contemplate and enjoy what he has made. A time for the man and the woman to relate to their Creator, perhaps. John 5, and verses 16 to 18 builds strikingly upon this idea of the seventh day, when Jesus says that my Father has been working from the beginning and he continues to work. And I think possibly that seventh day of rest is meant to suggest God's continuing work of, sorry, it seems a bit odd to speak of work in relation to rest, but let me just continue the sentence. That day of rest is meant to suggest perhaps that God now continues to sustain in being the created order which is brought into being. And maybe that's what Jesus is referring to in John chapter 5. So a very clear, a very distinct picture of God, the world and humanity. And this picture is fundamental for what follows in the Bible. In this chapter we're introduced to what will be key ideas in Genesis and key ideas throughout the rest of the Bible. Genesis 1 is a vision of how things ought to be. These are God's ideals for his creation. We're presented here with a harmonious world in which men and women in God's image rule the world on God's behalf and in obedience to God. It's also, this text, an implicit polemic against ancient Near Eastern views of the gods and creation. You can describe Genesis 1 as an aggressively monotheistic creation account. It's an account which echoes other ancient Near Eastern creation texts, but at point after point rules out the idea that any god other than the God of Israel created this world and everything in it. Okay, that's Enuma Elish. Ancient Near Eastern flood accounts. I don't know if you knew that there are flood accounts that have come down to us from the ancient Near East. In fact, there are quite a few texts which either describe a flood or at least refer to a flood, some kind of primeval flood. Two Babylonian texts which speak of a primordial flood. A text known as Gilgamesh, and Tablet 11 of the Gilgamesh epic, as it's called, contains a flood account, and Atrahasis. This is a somewhat more fragmentary text. These texts seem to have been quite widely known in Mesopotamia during the Old Testament period. These texts are extant in a number of copies dating from the 2nd and 1st millennia BC. I will read part of the account from Gilgamesh Tablet 11, as that's the clearest text. There are a number of divine names, mainly the names of gods of storm, lightning, and water. There are also some poetic expressions in this text, but the general meaning, I hope you'll find, is clear. The plot of the entire flood account in Gilgamesh is as follows. Humanity was created to work on behalf of the gods, principally by growing and providing them with food for sacrifices. So humanity was created, as it were, as slave labor for the gods. But humans became too numerous. They were making too much noise, so the chief god, Enlil in this account, tried various means to get rid of them, and finally sent a flood. But one man and his family were tipped off by one of the gods, because part of the points about these polytheistic texts is that sometimes the gods disagree with each other, and if one god decides to do something, another god finds a way to undo that decision. So it is here. Atrahasis, in the Atrahasis text, or the same person, but he's called Utnapishtim in the Gilgamesh account, escaped the flood. They were tipped off by another god. They built an ark which enabled them to ride above the waters of the flood which the gods sent. So already we have some similarities, I think you'll notice, with Genesis 6 to 8. The warning of a coming flood, such that one man constructs an ark and saves himself and large numbers of animals. So this is, I need the right text here. Gilgamesh. Right. On the 7th day, the ship was completed. They brought on gangplanks fore and aft. They came up her side 2/3 of her height. Whatever I had loaded upon her, what silver I had loaded upon her, what gold I had loaded upon her, what living creatures I had loaded upon her, I made go aboard all my family and kin, beasts of the steppe, wild animals of the steppe, all skilled craftsmen I made go on board. Shamash, a deity, set for me an appointed time. In the morning when it spates in cakes, in the evening when it rains in grain, we speak about it raining cats and dogs, they spoke about it raining cakes and grain, some heavy drops of rain, okay? In the morning, go into your ship, batten the door. The appointed time arrived. In the morning, spates in cakes, in the evening, rain in grain. I gazed upon the appearance of the storm. The storm was frightful to behold. I went into the ship and battened my door. To the caulker of the ship, the boatman, I gave away my palace with all its possessions. At the first glimmer of dawn, a black cloud rose up from the horizon. Inside the cloud, Adad, storm deity, was thundering, while Shulat and Hanish went on before, moving as a retinue over the hill and plain. Eragal tore out the dike posts. Ninurta came and brought with him the dikes. The Anuna gods held torches aloft, setting the land ablaze with their glow, thunder and lightning. Adad's awesome power passed over the heavens. The storm wind blew swiftly. It was passing over the people like a battle. No one could see his neighbor, nor could the people see each other in the downpour. The gods became frightened at the deluge. They shrank back and went up to Anu's highest heaven. The gods cowered like dogs, crouching outside. Ishtar screamed like a woman in childbirth, and sweet-voiced Belet Ili moaned aloud. Would that day had turned to naught when I spoke up for evil in the assembly of the gods. How could I have spoken up for evil in the assembly of the gods and spoken up for an assault to the death against my people? It was I myself who made my people. Now, like fish spawn, they choke up the sea. The Anuna gods, so the gods now, most of them are regretting this idea of sending a flood. The Anuna gods were weeping with her. The gods sat where they were, weeping. Their lips were parched, taking on a crust. Because they're hungry and thirsty. No one's there to offer them sacrifices. 6 days and 7 nights the wind continued. The deluge and windstorm leveled the land. When the 7th day arrived, the windstorm and deluge left off their assault, which they had launched like a fight to the death. The sea grew calm. The tempest grew still. The deluge ceased. I looked at the weather. Stillness reigned. And all of mankind had turned to clay. In a way, dust has returned to dust. Only because there's water around, it's clay, mud. The landscape was flat as a terrace. I opened the hatch. Daylight fell on my face. Crumpling over, I sat down and wept, tears running down my face. I beheld the edges of the world, bordering the sea. At 12 times 60 leagues, a mountain rose up. The boat rested on Mount Nimush. Mount Nimush held the boat fast, not allowing it to move. One day, a second day, Mount Nimush held the boat fast. A third day, a fourth day, Mount Nimush held the boat fast. A fifth day, a sixth day, Mount Nimush held the boat fast. When the 7th day arrived, I released a dove to go free. The dove went and returned. No landing place came to view. It turned back. I released a swallow to go free. The swallow went and returned. No landing place came to view. It turned back. I set a raven free. The raven went forth, saw the ebbing of the waters. It ate, circled, left droppings, and did not turn back. I released all to the 4 cardinal points, all the animals in the boat. I set up an offering stand on the top of the mountain. 7 and 7 cult vessels I set out. I heaped reeds, cedar, and myrtle in their bowls. The gods smelled the savour. The gods smelled the sweet savour. The gods crowded around the sacrificer like flies. Now, I remember when I was first introduced to this text over 30 years ago in an Old Testament lecture in Manchester. I remember thinking, goodness, there's an awful lot of things in common with Genesis 6 to 8 there. A flood, a man and his family are warned of the flood beforehand. They make an ark. The ark rides out the waters of the flood, comes to rest on a mountain. Birds are sent out. The third bird it's a third bird that makes a difference. And then the man comes out of the ark and offers a sacrifice. Many points of similarity with the account in Genesis 6 to 8. Also many differences. Gilgamesh is a polytheistic text. The reason given for sending the flood is that humanity are noisy. In Genesis, it's because humanity are sinful and violent. In Gilgamesh, the sacrifices feed the gods. The idea is that the gods have got hungry because no humans are around to offer them food during the flood. A sacrifice is offered in Genesis, but there's no suggestion that it feeds God. So significant similarities, significant differences. There are other relevant... Have I got ahead of myself? What happened? Oh, sorry. So there you are. There are the similarities and differences. I think I need to skip a little quickly over this section. There are other texts which mention a flood. A Sumerian flood account, a somewhat fragmentary text. A Sumerian king list, which interestingly, again I won't read it out, lists kings who are said to have lived both before and after the flood. These kings before the flood live for huge numbers of years, sort of tens of thousands of years, or even hundreds of thousands of years in some case. After the flood, they live for somewhat shorter periods, thousands or hundreds of years only. A bit like the way in Genesis that the ages of people gradually go down as you read through from the genealogies in chapter 5 and onwards. Now, I've read out a number of Old Testament texts, or referred to a number of Old Testament texts. It is not suggesting, I'm not suggesting, that Genesis 1 to 11 borrowed directly from any of these texts. It's just that these texts come from the ancient Near East at around the same period as Genesis, and there are some similarities with Genesis 1 to 11 in these texts. Clearly the themes of Genesis 1 to 11 are found in other ancient, or some of the themes at least, are found in other ancient Near Eastern texts outside Israel. Though again, I mean, the flood account in Genesis has certain distinct features of its own, most noticeably the greater focus on human wickedness, given as the reason for sending the flood. That's something absent from the other accounts that are known to us from the ancient Near East. I could say more about this, but I think I need to move on. Pulling it together. So let's think further about Genesis 1 to 11 and these other ancient Near Eastern texts we referred to. Note some striking similarities with Genesis, some striking differences. Genesis 1 to 11 seems to me to be kicking against many of the conceptions of the world, of the gods, and of humanity found in these other ancient Near Eastern texts. For example, Genesis 1 to 11, when we said this is monotheistic, not polytheistic, God's reasons for creating man are not so that man women should work for him, but I mean, that's not given as a reason. On the contrary, it's God who supplies man with food, not the human beings who are supposed to supply the gods with food, as in the ancient Near Eastern texts. God encourages humans to multiply, doesn't check the spread of humanity, whereas, if you remember in Gilgamesh, humanity becomes too numerous, so the gods send a flood. So there's a very different attitude. God has very different reasons and for creating man and woman, and a very different attitude towards the man and the woman he's created compared to the reasons of the gods in these ancient Near Eastern texts. Genesis 1 to 11 differs from these other texts in the realm of morality. The Babylonian gods, for example, deceive each other. They send a flood for what seems to be a trivial reason. God sends the flood for a more serious reason, because of human wickedness, and he rescues Noah because of his righteousness. There's a moral quality in the Genesis account, a moral aspect, which is largely absent from the ancient Near Eastern texts. The flood account in Genesis focuses on God's covenant with humankind. Again, that's not a theme found in the ancient Near Eastern texts. More generally, whereas a text like the Sumerian flood account, which I just mentioned briefly, seems to reflect a belief that human history progresses, things get better as human history proceeds, Genesis 1 to 11 seems to believe that things began well, or does believe that things began well, and then deteriorated sharply because of sin. Genesis 1 to 11 has a different view of where history is going compared to the other ancient Near Eastern texts. For Genesis 1 to 11, human achievements do not necessarily entail progress. That's the point of the account of Cain's descendants. In Genesis 4, 17 to 24, Cain's city and his descendants. It seems to have been quite a technologically advanced civilization, the civilization of Cain and his descendants. They had metalwork, they had stock rearing, some of them made music. It was technologically advanced, but also violent. And in chapter 11, we have the Tower of Babel account, where humans work together, they build together, but they do it all in opposition to God. So, for Genesis, things can get worse as history proceeds, as well as getting better. Technological advances can be used for bad reasons, as well as for good reasons. Genesis 1 to 11 is less optimistic about human history than the other ancient Near Eastern texts seem to be. In his 1987 commentary, Gordon Wenham puts it this way. A very useful commentary, by the way, Gordon Wenham on Genesis 1 to 15. Genesis 1 to 11, as we read it, is a commentary often highly critical on ideas current in the ancient world about the natural and supernatural world. Both individual stories as well as a final completed work seem to be a polemic against many of the commonly received notions about the gods and man. But the clear polemical thrust of Genesis 1 to 11 must not obscure the fact that at certain points, biblical and extra-biblical thought, that's ancient extra-biblical thought, ancient Near Eastern thought, are in clear agreement. Indeed, Genesis and the ancient Near East probably have more in common with each other than either has with modern secular thought. That is, on the one hand, Genesis 1 to 11 takes ideas and themes familiar to anyone who has lived in the ancient Near East and offers a distinctive take on these ideas and themes, and clearly rejects many of the views represented in the ancient Near Eastern texts known to us. That's true. Genesis 1 to 11 is at many points different from these other ancient Near Eastern texts, but we must not overplay this point. We must remember that Genesis 1 to 11 is itself a text from the ancient Near East. Now, we tend to forget this point because the books of the Old Testament have been read continuously for 2,000 years and more, since they were first written down, from the time when they were first written down to the present. In this respect, they are unlike texts such as Gilgamesh and Enuma Elish, which were only rediscovered 150 years ago. But to restate, Genesis 1 to 11 originated in the world of Gilgamesh and Enuma Elish and other such texts. Now, we tend to read Genesis 1 to 11 as though these chapters were written to attack modern materialistic theories of the origins of the universe, as though Genesis 1 to 11 was the same kind of text as Charles Darwin's Origins of Species or Stephen Hawking's A Brief History of Time. But Genesis 1 to 11 was originally written not to attack atheistic materialism, but to attack ancient polytheistic views of creation and human origins. And that's clear from the many links, conceptual links, between Genesis 1 to 11 and other ancient Near Eastern texts. This is relevant to the issue of interpretation. Our interpretation of Genesis 1 to 11 must be governed by what kind of text we believe it to be. We must not assume that we know in advance what kind of text we are dealing with. And to conclude this first section, that is why knowledge of the ancient Near Eastern literary context of Genesis 1 to 11 is important. It gives us a sense of what kind of text it is, and that will be important for what follows. Well, we're doing quite well. There is, I think, a break is scheduled for roughly 9:45, but I'm aware that many of these texts I've read out may not have been familiar to you, or you may have been vaguely aware of them, I don't know. A lot of this may have been quite new, so I'm very happy at this point to take questions on you about what I've said so far. Are there any questions that you would like to ask? I believe there is a roving mic if necessary.
There's a roving mic, and just a reminder, you might have to repeat the questions.
Thank you.
Maybe I'll start it off so that I give you guys a bit of time to think. I think some of us might be curious why there might be so many similarities between these ancient texts, if indeed there was one true account of history. So how did that come to be? Did someone borrow from another, or did it get kind of blurred in the different oral histories of different...
Right. Do Genesis 1 to 11 and all these other ancient Near Eastern texts all go back to kind of one common source? Or should we think indeed of these other ancient Near Eastern texts as kind of corrupted versions of Genesis 1 to 11? Well, we don't know. I mean, there's... I spoke of tens of thousands of texts coming down from the ancient Near East, but that's just a small percentage of the texts that at one point existed. I remember Alan Millard, the British sort of Akkadian and Old Testament specialist, who's come to BGST as a guest lecturer a few times in the past years, being asked, how many more texts are there waiting to be discovered in the ancient Near East? And he said, well, there was once an archaeologist sort of going around part of Iraq, and he noticed a large number of mounds, over a quite large plain, say 40, 50-mile plain, a number of mounds. And he said, well, probably in each of those mounds, if you dig them, there's going to be hundreds of tablets, but we don't have time, so let's take this mound. And the other mounds are still undug. There's probably a lot still waiting to be dug up. I don't think you can claim that that Genesis 1 to 11 borrows directly from any of the texts I've mentioned, or indeed that these texts borrow from Genesis 1 to 11. And sort of, obviously, in that case, I suppose the argument would be that they give a very polytheistic spin to what was originally a monotheistic account. No, it's that these ancient Near Eastern texts seem to suggest the ways in which people thought of creation and human origins and the rise of human civilization And when we set Genesis 1 to 11 against these texts, you can see that Genesis 1 to 11 takes a very different view of these matters. I mean, okay, if you asked, is there any case where Genesis 1 seems to be directly kicking against one of the texts known to us, then I suppose that part of the Gilgamesh, where you get those a number of points of contact, you know, flood, family in a boat, boat comes to a mountain, birds are sent out, sacrifices are offered. A similar pattern. I mean, yes, there may be some borrowing there, but I suspect it's at second or third or maybe fourth or fifth hand. So the relation of all these texts to each other and what they all go back to, these are lost in the mists of history. Thank you.
That was quite an unfair question, I know.
No, it's okay.
Maybe another one though. Again, it might be difficult, but what might the situation of the original hearers, the children of Israel, at a certain point in their history, what might it have been that this was so important for them to know at that point? Was it as they were preparing to enter Canaan, and was it as they came out of Egypt, having heard 400 years of this kind of stories? Why?
Okay, why was it so important that, say, texts like Genesis 1 should be written stressing the kind of things they did, this very, as I put it, aggressively monotheistic presentation of creation? Well, I suppose we come here to the question of the dating of of Genesis, and I know you've done some Old Testament studies, so you'll be aware that there's various theories about the sources of the Pentateuch and all this kind of stuff and different dates. I think the message of Genesis, it has been suggested, for example, that Genesis 6 belongs to what's called the priestly account, which was written maybe in Babylon at the time of the exile, and that in that context, they were living in a polytheistic city in which there were actually large images of the gods all around them. At that point, the Israelites needed to be told, no, our God is the one who created. I don't myself actually believe that view of the composition of the Pentateuch. What I would say is that the teaching of Genesis 1 was a teaching that the Israelites needed to hear at virtually every point of the history, whether you're talking time of the patriarchs, time when they were in Egypt, time when they came out of Egypt and were going to confront the gods of Canaan, time later when they were in exile and seemed to be under the power of the gods of Babylon. It's a perennially relevant message, and therefore perhaps not that easy to tie down to one historical context. Again, thank you for the question. Thank you.
On page 2 of this
yes.
handout, pulling it together,
yes.
there is a point that we have made here,
yeah.
that the flood account in Genesis focuses on God's covenant
yes.
with humankind. My question is, why is it that God needs to make covenants with humankind?
Why does God need to make covenants with humankind as he makes a covenant with Noah in Genesis 9? By way of expressing his commitment to us. By way of reassuring us of his good intentions towards us. I think this is the point of all the biblical covenants, including the new covenant instituted by our Lord Jesus. It's so that we may know that God's intentions to us are good. And so in Genesis 9, the covenant is made, I'll never again send a flood on the face of the earth. Our God is a covenant-making God. I don't think I can put it a more complicated answer than that occurs to me.
God spoke and creation came.
Yes, yes.
He spoke, so it was enough.
Mm.
Why is it that God takes the second step of making a covenant?
To cater for our weakness, our human weakness, as a way of condescending to our state and making it known to us that he is committed to us. When God reveals itself, it's always in terms we can understand and for our benefit. And I think God's covenants are like that. And because a covenant involves a human party, God can't simply say in the covenants which require a response from humans, like say the covenant in Deuteronomy sets out the terms that Israel must follow if they're to live in the land. God can't, as it were, automatically make us obey. So he can't actually speak and automatically we obey because he's given us a free will. So in a way, God's act of speaking creation and God's act of speaking when he makes a covenant, though there are similarities between them, they're both expressions of the divine will, are also different in that God chooses not to command our obedience when he makes a covenant. And so in that case, it's different from God speaking and creation coming into being. Thank you. Hello?
I was wondering whether there is an A&E parallel to the Bible's account of the fall of man.
No. Is there an ancient Near Eastern parallel to the Bible's account of the fall of man? An account in which the humans transgress a divine command, sin, break a covenant, it might be said. No, there isn't, and that's one of the distinctive ideas in Genesis. And part of its view that basically humanity is in trouble, which again is part of the message of Genesis 1 to 11. That's one of the things distinctive about Genesis 1 to 11. As far as we can tell from the texts known to us. I mean, there are ancient Eastern texts which make it clear that, yes, the writers were aware that life was a pretty grim business sometimes. And I mean, it's not that all is roses in the ancient Near Eastern text, ancient Near Eastern texts, far from it. But there's no text in which, having been originally in a blessed state of communion with God, the man and the woman turn from God and lose that blessed state. In the ancient Near Eastern texts, they weren't created blessed to start with. They were supposed to do the heavy works, or dig channels and irrigate fields and provide food for these hungry gods who couldn't be bothered to do the work for themselves. So it's a very different view of the divine purposes in creating human beings and the way in which God relates to human beings. Thank you.
Can I just add a bit?
Mm-hmm.
Can I add a bit? Nothing personal. I think the covenantal God is a greater party. We are the lesser party.
Oh, yes, yes.
Okay. Then can I ask a question? In the one of the statement there, the firmament, day 2, it is used as dome, D-O-M-E, like as though the first heaven, second heaven. I think Genesis, that day 2, refer to a more broader understanding, to keep the word firmament without the interference of so-called Darwinism and modernistic whatever. I think the person who used the word firmament in like King James, when there was no corruption of text. So firmament, kept in that context, would stretch the day 2 into the whole universe. I know I'm bringing up too soon, but that's a
yes, and
but because used in this text here, doom, it restricts the whole process of thinking into earth-based. But I don't think God has the intention to make it earth-based alone. In the separation of waters, I'm not talking about, so the word doom tends to restrict the heaven into the first, second, third. Of course, third heaven is where God dwells. Here, the implication of the translation, doom, is like first heaven kind of perception. Sorry, just...
I think you're introducing into the text, so the question related to the translation dome, and should it be dome or firmament, and are there many heavens, and by the way, brother, I question your view of the King James as a translation made when the texts were not corrupt. That wouldn't be the view of most Old Testament. I mean, anyway, that's a separate issue. the word translated firmament, King James Version, dome in my NRSV, means something just rolled out. It's like a layer. The idea is perhaps of hammering out a sheet of metal to make a thin plate. Is that kind of shape of object. Whether you choose to translate that dome, or whether I forget what do you have in the NIV? What? Vault, yeah. Yeah. But it's a metaphor anyway.
Expanse.
Yeah. Expanse. Yeah. But can we leave this till later? We're getting into technical stuff, which yeah, please. Mm. Yeah. So what? Sorry, I can't hear you.
Hello. In elsewhere of scripture, it says the heaven is rolled out like a scroll.
Yeah.
So it's not a shape, not a dome. Thanks. Okay, enough.
Yeah, I think enough.
Thank you. There'll be questions.
Yep.
There'll be time for questions later.
In the creation account, the concept of time is brought in. Time.
Is
Time.
yes, go on.
Yeah. So we talk about days.
Yes.
Are we to interpret these days as the way we know day in the present context? Or is it just a period of time?
Not as literal 24-hour days in my view, but I'll come back to this in the third section. Yep.
Okay, I think we have a break now. Okay, Dr. Satterthwaite will be here, so
Yep.
please feel free to ask any questions at the break, but do give him some time to break as well.
When I've had my coffee and been to the
But just bearing in mind the sequence of how it was going, we were starting with the ancient Near East, all right, and we'll move towards some of the questions about literal, non-literal. So try to ask the kind of questions at that point of the presentation. So thank you very much for understanding. Well, time now is 10:45, according to that big clock up there. Let's be back here by 11:15, 11:10 preferably. All right, so please proceed now to the fellowship.